I'm Claudine Wong, joining you from the San Francisco Bay Area and welcoming three people with us. We've got Dana Dornsife, who is the CEO of the Lazarus Cancer Foundation. We also have Dr. Hella Borno, who is the Assistant Professor of Medicine, Division of Hematology and Oncology at UCSF. And we also have Becky Stevens, who's a clinical trial participant. Thank you to all of you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
This is an important conversation, and for those who are just joining and trying to figure out where this discussion is going, let me just kind of give them a brief outline. The COVID discussion has really gotten us all thinking a lot about clinical trials, about how quickly we can get treatments into the general population, about the process. I mean, we've done so much analyzing about that. So Dr. Bonar, you've written a paper really on how this COVID discussion is really going to change clinical trial participation. Dana, I know that your organization works a lot with trying to get more access to people who are going through clinical trials, specifically for cancer. And then Becky, you are on the front lines of this, understanding how to be in these trials and really how important they can be. So, you know, in the big picture, before we get to specifically how COVID is affecting this, Dana, I want to go to you. So, and let's talk about access to clinical trials and what Lazarus Cancer Foundation is doing. I mean, there's a lot of discussions, and we've talked about these discussions before about access to clinical trials, and really before this, it's been cost, it's been proper representation, and all of that making a difference in really how many people can participate and how this all works.
Yeah, so, you know, historically, cancer patients already have a lot of challenges in relation to enrolling in clinical trials, having access to clinical trials, and actually being able to get to their clinical trial. And that's why Lazarus exists, to remove those barriers. COVID-19 really just adds to that complexity. Now we have patients who are already dealing with an uncertain future, having to now deal with the uncertainty of what little routine they've been able to come up with and put together in relation to fighting their disease through cancer clinical trials. And so, you know, now they're already immunocompromised. They're, you know, not being able to see their doctors in the way that they used to, and they're fearful of additional exposure. So, you know, adding a coronavirus disease on top of cancer it's just unthinkable, unimaginable for our patients.
It is scary for people who don't understand the process. I mean, I think a lot of the discussion has always been on, can you get into the clinical trial, right? Like that's been the key, and maybe don't realize, you know, and I wanted to play this video that is just one of your guys' videos about that's the first step. First, you got to get in. First, there has to be one that's available. First, there, you know, and all those things. But being a part of them, it can be a very stressful, difficult thing as well.
Yes, that is correct. You know, by the time a patient is entering into a cancer clinical trial, they're spent in so many ways. You know, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and sadly, financially. And so being able to bring patients into the fold of cancer clinical trials and allow them to have really equitable access to take advantage of medical breakthroughs in technology is great. You know, but again, this disease just, you know, puts, you know, adds so many more complexities. And in fact, you know, we're seeing some of our patients who would normally fly to their trials calling us and saying, I can't fly, I want to drive, but, you know, I can't, it's far away. It takes me a whole day to get there. Can I stay? You know, now they're hesitant to stay in a hotel because of COVID-19. So it's really challenging. But I know that Dr. Borno, in having some conversations with her about our patients like Becky, you know, UCSF has come up with some great ways to try and manage that.
So Becky, I want you to explain, I'm going to get to Dr. Borno in a second because I want her to talk about this paper that she just wrote on really kind of the changes. But Becky, give us just a really quick, you know, description of what life is like for you. How long have you been participating in a clinical trial?
So I was diagnosed with cancer just over a year ago, and I did traditional chemotherapy for a while, and then we found that that was really successful, but not successful enough to get rid of the cancer. And so we reached out to UCSF, who I had a prior relationship with, because my type of cancer is a very specific type that kind of is very difficult to treat, and not that much known about. And so we were able to hook in with UCSF, and they found a clinical trial that would work for me. So I've been on it for about 6 months. The goal of my clinical trial is stability, so to make the cancer not grow and just kind of keep it the same, and it's been really successful. Traditionally, what I do is once a month, I live about 2 hours away. I drive in to San Francisco for my appointment. They're back to back to back to back. I do all of my appointments in one day, and then I turn around and drive home on the same day. Is that kind of what you're looking for?
Yeah. And so how has COVID-19 changed the way you get your treatment?
So I'm really lucky in that mine is not, it's an oral pill that I take. And so it's not one where I need to go in specifically to be infused. So I was able to figure out a workaround with the help of UCSF and my local doctors here, where I could get my blood work taken here. I did a video visit with my doctor. I had someone come and take my vitals at my house. So I was able to kind of do everything that I usually do at UCSF remotely.
Which is great, which has probably taken a lot of stress off your shoulders. Dr. Barno, how common is her situation though, in her ability, Becky's ability to kind of transition that easily versus other patients and other types of clinical trials? Can they do the same?
I think Becky nicely summarizes what all medical oncologists are trying to do. We are operating under this imperative of risk reduction. And so for a lot of our patients, we may be deploying therapies that increase the risk of infection. And so if you think about treating patients with a therapy that increases the risk of infection in the context of a pandemic, that's terrifying. And so we constantly have to ask the question, is the need to have that patient present to a facility absolutely necessary? And weighing out the benefits of presenting to a facility versus the risks of potentially being exposed to the virus. And so I think Becky's example nicely summarizes some of the changes that have been made. So, across the healthcare system, the uptake of telemedicine has been dramatic. So we really are trying to communicate with our patients telephonically or through video visits to ascertain the information we need in order to make sure that they're safe and well and not experiencing toxicities that aren't being managed. We are rethinking whether or not a blood draw is necessary at every given time point. That's certainly part of conventional care. And then if it's necessary in the context of a clinical trial, we ask the question, where can they get that blood draw as easily as possible, as quickly as possible, with the least amount of interaction with others. And that's really underpinned by this imperative to reduce risk. And then, of course, there's the question of how do they get drug? And Becky is fortunately on an oral therapy, as she described, so being able to get the drug delivered to your home is an ideal circumstance. That's not necessarily the case for all patients who may require infusions and so have to actually physically present to a healthcare system, but we really are trying to rethink ways to make something that is usually very high touch less so in order to protect patients from the risk of exposure.
So some of the changes, I think about, in journalism, there are things that we can do, and I can do these Zoom calls. We prefer to go to you and talk to you and see labs and see things, but we can do this. Some of the things it's because we have to do. And then sometimes I think we're looking at the way we're doing things and saying, well, is this a better way to do it? Where does all this fall? I know that you really talked about this and how COVID-19 is going to change the way we look in general at clinical trials, right? It's how do we address the people we have now and how do we do this in the future? Because certainly when we're looking at COVID-19 treatments, everyone wants to speed those up and figure out how we can do that in an efficient way.
Well, I think when you're thinking about cancer clinical research, the most important thing is patient safety. Right now, we're dealing with something that is extremely high risk for our patients, which is this pandemic. And so that's definitely putting pressure to redesign the way that we deliver care. I think in some ways pressure that is necessary and that will hopefully make us rethink the burdens we place on patients, especially the burden of travel and representing to facilities. But because we are focused on patient safety, I think that that has led preferentially to in-person visits, physical evaluations, frequent blood monitoring and imaging, all to detect a potential, quote, adverse event, something bad happening to our patient and something bad happening as a result of the intervention that we're deploying, which is, the therapeutic drug. In this context, patient safety, the something bad that's on everyone's mind, of course, is the risk of infection from COVID-19. And so that is coloring and appropriately informing the way that patients are being managed, both in the context of a clinical trial, but also as part of sort of routine cancer care.
Yeah. And Dana, if I bring you back in on this, I want to, when you're talking about, I know that you focus a lot on travel expenses and how that's been difficult for patients to be involved in clinical trials. Is the upshoot of this, if we can figure out how to do more clinical trials through telemedicine, that it opens up, and that maybe while this increased danger to patients is obviously causing a high level of stress, that in the long term, if we can get them into the people that they need to see, get them part of these clinical trials where travel won't be as necessary, isn't that a bonus?
It's a huge bonus, and it's one that I really hope that we can harness the value of that and really look at this terrible, COVID-19 pandemic and come out on the other side with something that is really has had a positive influence on the way that cancer patients, are being treated and the way that we set up our cancer clinical trials for patients. There's been, for many years now, there's been so much talk in the industry about decentralizing trials or having virtual trials or, taking the trial to where the patient is. And, there are numerous articles and, webinars, everything, that addresses that. But really, there hasn't been a lot of action taken to make that happen. And I think the reason for that is that it requires so many different stakeholders to come together and unify and do something that is counterintuitive to the way that they've always done it. And COVID-19 has literally thrust us into this situation where we've had to unify with each other, we've had to come together, and we've had to work with each other in ways that we'd never consider, previously, and do so very, very rapidly.
Well, I think, the stats that your folks sent to us were saying that less than 5% of cancer patients participate in clinical trials. A fraction of those patients are minorities. More than 50% of clinical trials fail because they can't get enough patients. And that cost to travel, again, is the biggest barrier. And that's something that you guys have been fighting against, but now people are, if you're talking about they can't get enough patients in a trial, if they don't have to travel, I would imagine you would get more.
Absolutely. I think that if we can reduce the burden on the patient will be more inclined to say, yes, this is something that I want to do.
Yeah. And Becky, let me bring you in on this too. Like, while you used to drive in and get all your treatments in one day, how much better is it at home? Is it better, or would you rather?
It's much better. I have 2 young children, and so not only is there stress on me, but every time I leave and I'm driving and I'm gone for the day, and we've had to figure out childcare, which is not a big deal, but the stress on them and they're so anxious knowing I'm going, and it's a big deal. And when will I get home? And how is mom? Not having to do that would be great. And when I was looking at clinical trials, I honestly looked at certain ones and went, oh, I have to go every 2 weeks. Nope, that's going to be too hard for me. Or, oh, I have to do this and then drive in the car 2 hours after a treatment. No, that's going to be too hard for me. I had to really balance my quality of life with what clinical trial I thought was going to.
Right. What if it was in Texas? If it was a clinical trial in Texas or something? There were some that you wouldn't even consider, just obviously.
Yes, and even ones that were close by, I still wouldn't consider some because it was just too much of a toll on the whole family.
Yeah, you have a life to live. Yeah.
if it was a virtual one, that would change things drastically. Or being able to, the girls were so happy when I didn't have to go last month. They just were like, oh, mom's home. And still I had to go and run and do some appointments, but it just was a quick appointment versus an all day gone.
Do you feel like the quality of care is still where you feel like, part of that face-to-face, and granted, no one can have a face-to-face right now, but part of that is to be able to ask questions. I mean, it is sometimes, we say telemedicine, that's great if you can actually get, to your doctor. When you have an appointment, you have their attention, you are in the building, you are in front of them, so you can ask everything. That's sometimes what you lose as well, though, in this process.
I think I already had the relationship with some of my doctors, and I do a lot of tele-talking and teleconferencing. So it wasn't a big thing for me. I could see where like an older potential cancer client would find that more difficult, but it's something I'm quite comfortable with. So I feel just as comfortable having a conversation via Zoom as I do in person with somebody. I go into it the same way. I have my list of questions ready, and I feel like it still worked really well. And I feel really blessed that I have a really good network of doctors that I had already established locally. So I can call upon them, and I have, a nurse advocate that I can call and puts out fires here and there and gets me everything I need, which I think is really important. So you have to have really good cohesion between your local doctor and the facility where you have your trial. And that's something that will, with clinical trials, have to get even better, because it's good, but there's always room for improvement.
Yeah, and I think, Dr. Boner, if we talk about that, I mean, certainly it's an idea when you're saying, okay, well, this is something we should look at, and absolutely we have to by necessity, but Becky could have a very different experience if she wasn't getting a hold of people that she needed and was constantly trying to work through the confusion of it. I wonder if you can address how long it would take to really feel like we have a good model for someone who is starting clinical trials, saying, okay, let's follow this model because this is what works in terms of accessibility and monitoring. And then on the other side of it too, I wonder if there is more digital health that's going to be brought in, so we can monitor people, whether, I know there's digital monitors for heart patients and things like that, so they don't have to also keep coming into a doctor's office when that can be strenuous.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot we need to study. We need to study how we're doing now. How is that patient experience? And we need to study how we can do it better. And I think, in the context of clinical care, patients are getting appointments for video visits, and we're treating it, I sit in front of a computer, I have a list of patients, I have a time to see them, and we're interacting like it's a clinic. It is really a digital clinic. And so they have that protected time, and they're guaranteed that protected time to go through their questions. So I think in terms of the challenges of contacting providers through the telephone, I totally understand, that point, but it is a clinic. And so patients have protected time, even if it is through a digital means. Mm-hmm. Now, I think one thing that needs to be explored, and Becky touched on this, is how comfortable are, all patients with this novel strategy of communication. And certainly there's going to be a diversity in patient experience with digital means of communication, a diversity in patient comfort. I think we need to understand how does this affect patients who are less comfortable with internet means of communication, patients who don't speak English, and how do you loop in a translator, and how can we make sure that we're communicating clearly, effectively, and carefully when we're talking about things as important as toxicities associated with cancer therapies. And so there's a lot we need to study, and there's likely vast room for improvement. And I think that we are, fortunately, in the context of this very scary time, going to learn ways to communicate more effectively with patients staying remote as an imperative of risk reduction, but also as a means to develop safer, high quality, distant care.
So what percentage of your patients do you think could successfully go to primarily telemedicine with, I imagine you always would have to have some in-person appointments, but what percentage could? And then depending on a different trial, you can't do it,
Right. So I would say, the vast majority of patients at UCSF can access Zoom and get on Zoom. Within our cancer center, we've had a lot of success in converting visits to video visits. There have been some occasions where a patient doesn't know how to get on Zoom, and they're social distancing, so their kid can't come over and, upload the software on their computer like they would usually. And so then that becomes a telephone visit, and that's just fine. There are circumstances where patients bring up symptoms that are worrisome, that are concerning, that just absolutely need a physical encounter, need a visit, need to get vitals, and need to do an exam. And so there are conversions after a video visit or a telephone visit to a in-person visit. And all of that is to ensure that people are safe. But I would say the vast majority of folks are able to get online and talk.
And Dana, you mentioned talking about the stress people have, obviously, of being in these trials and wanting to stay safe. Are you also getting the feedback from people like Becky and who are saying, you know what, on the silver lining side of this process has been better? And do you hope that would encourage more people to also sign up? When we go back to life, I don't know if it'll ever be what it was,
Yeah.
but it'll certainly be into our as close to what was our reality, that there'll be another way you can talk to people about why a clinical trial, and if it's mostly telemedicine and it's in, you know, a different state and they do have to travel maybe once, but all the rest of their appointments are telemedicine, and they can have things mailed to them, that it's easier to talk to someone about entering that kind of phase.
Absolutely. I think all of those things would be incredibly beneficial to the patient in reducing the burden on the patient of clinical trial participation. We've been in touch with about 18 of our patients that we support on an ongoing basis just to check in and see how things are going. And most of them have had a very positive experience. And while this situation with COVID-19 is not ideal, for sure, and you know, we have a long runway before we can really figure this whole thing out, I think that what we're seeing is that it's possible. It can be done, and we can reduce the burden on patients, and we can really make it a win-win for everybody. We can make it a win-win for the patient because it's less burdensome. We get to, you know, for doctors like Dr. Borno, whose time is so valuable, and or her skill set is tremendous, and she can really focus all of her attention on those patients who need her the most. It's better use of our resources. So all around, I really feel like, you know, we've got an opportunity here to take this terrible situation and really come out, you know, look in the rear view mirror and say, wow, you know, look where we are now. I really think there's a lot of positive outcome from this.
Yeah, I mean, Becky, do you think had they given you the option before it was a necessity, right, before it was COVID driven, and it was just like, hey, here are your options. You can come in and you can do these appointments in person, and that's your choice if you feel more comfortable, or we can mail these to you and you can take these and check with us on, you know, on the phone or on Zoom. What would you have chosen?
Oh, I would have jumped at the opportunity. I fought a lot through the process to try and get as many appointments as possible, as much of my care as possible locally, because I knew the burden and the time and the stress on everyone. And, you know, luckily there's things like the Lazarus Foundation that were able to help us financially to be able to get to San Francisco, and UCSF was really accommodating and really helpful and really let me kind of work with what I needed to get it to work even before COVID. And they've been fantastic through this to help me, support me as much as possible without having me have to have the burden of the travel.
How much left of your clinical trial?
Forever.
How much time?
Forever.
So in the long term too, I mean, even after it's safe to return to an all-day appointment, will you be advocating to stay on
Oh,
this
if I can,
regimen?
yeah. Yeah, definitely.
And Dr. Borno, do you think there'll be more of a discussion to keep people who like it on it? I mean, if it's a less of a burden on someone's, I think, emotional state, that can't be a bad thing in treatment as well.
No, I mean, I think it's really interesting to hear Becky's perspective, because I think we're going to be forced to think about why make her come back when she's doing so well as an outpatient. She's, you know, stable on her treatment. She's not reporting new toxicities, and this is better for her quality of life. Why make her, you know, disrupt her day to come be seen? I think these are really important questions, and we're being forced to ask these questions today. I'm hopeful that, you know, these changes will be durable. The reality is COVID-19, whether we like it or not, is going to be with us for some time. I think this risk of infection, until the point that we have a widespread vaccination, is going to be ever present, and there will always be this need for risk reduction. And so I think, until that point where we have widespread vaccination, we will be thinking about reducing visits. And I think in the, moving in the future and thinking about our future after the fact, this will have likely a durable impact on the way that we design these clinical trials.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this day and age when we can look at things together, I mean, I just had a telemedicine appointment that I was planning on going in, but obviously not. And we covered everything, so, it did make me question, did I have to drive? Did I have to, I mean, I'm always happy to see my doctor in person, but did I have to do it? Dana, then advocacy from that point forward, you have the discussion started. You have a lot of people taking a look at it, some people who were already wanting to, and then some people who maybe had to be convinced that it should be at the top of their discussion list. How do you push this forward in terms of, I think Dr. Bono makes the point that there's not a magic, star on our calendar where we're like, okay, everything goes back to normal, however much we want that to be. So how do you make the most of this situation that we've all been forced into it so it leads to good as we come out of it?
Yeah, so I think cooperation is really what needs to take place between, influencers and stakeholders who wouldn't necessarily think about cooperating with each other. And I think from a patient advocacy perspective, what we need to do is identify those stakeholders, understand the roles that they have played traditionally in the cancer space, and understand and kind of look at a new definition of that role and how we can bring all of them together in the spirit of cooperation so that everyone, they own their part and their piece, but, they realize that in trusting another stakeholder to take on partial responsibility is okay, and we need to be able to build that up. So clearly, it's new rules of engagement, but I think that there is enough of a return on investment, not just from a dollars and cents perspective, but truly from a human perspective, that we'll be able to bring everybody together and make it happen.
Well, clinical trials are so important. We certainly want to beat COVID-19, and gosh darn it, do we want to beat cancer? Absolutely, yeah. And 100%. So I appreciate that conversation. I always like to hear about things that we will benefit from in this very difficult time. And certainly if patients and clinical trials and all of that will benefit coming out of this to fight all these terrible diseases that we're working against, that is a good thing.
Agreed.
So Dana Dornsife, CEO of Lazarus Cancer Foundation, Dr. Hella Borno, Assistant Professor of Medicine at the Division of Hematology and Oncology at UCSF, and Becky Stevens, in your clinical trial, best of luck to you. Thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Claudine.
Thank you.
And you can always find more on our website, coronavirusnow.com. Thanks so much for tuning in.